blind leading the blind. Where do we use that in? Yeah. That reference here to the United States Congress. We don't get political on adult forums.
That's just a statement of fact.
It's just a statement of fact. The point being that the language, sometimes we use things, let me throw out another, to reap the whirlwind. Have you heard that phrase before? Now, what does that mean, Tim?
It has to do with if you do something bad, the end result will be nothing like good.
Yeah,
you can't grab a whirlwind.
Yeah, the comment is if you do something bad, there's nothing good that will come out of that. To reap the whirlwind is to reap ill. Do we use that phrase commonly? Do you hear that? Yeah. Actually, I hear it misquoted. I mean, but that's part of the language. Let me throw it.
Where does that come from? Is that what this is?
I think it is. Yeah. What hath God wrought? What's that?
We were just talking about it.
Yeah.
It has a connection.
Inherit the Wind is the title of the play that's based on the Scopes Monkey trial. And to inherit the wind is, do you all know that phrase? I mean, and that is to inherit nothing. And that's the suggestion there, referring to the play about the Scopes Monkey trial. What was that? Tennessee? Yes. Yeah. What hath God wrought? That ring a bell? Alexander Graham Bell. Does that ring a bell? Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm trying to keep you awake this morning. Again, there are phrases like that in the book of Genesis. Wrought, W-R-O-U-G-H-T. Do we use that word? No.
If you're talking about
if you're talking about ironworks, you talk about that. When my kids come home with their report cards, they say, "What hath thou wrought?" Don't tell them I told you that. Tim?
Do you have time for a general question?
I do. Yeah.
So, that King James is where we get thou.
Yeah.
And I always thought that thou was a very formal way of addressing something, but it's interesting that when I actually looked at it, it's derived, English doesn't have a formal and informal you, unlike most other East Germanic and Latin languages, but it's derived from the familiar. And my question is, did the authors of the King James Version, is that what their intention was to convey intimacy with God?
The question that being asked has to do with the word thou, and whether that's a formal address or a familiar. It's familiar as opposed to formal. In German, when you address someone with du, that's informal. Sie is the formal, du is the familiar. You have to go through a ritual in German culture with someone in order to move from the Sie, formal address, to the du. It's called a Dutzend, and it involves a lot of beer. But it's absolutely right that we think of thou as a formal form of address. It is not. It is a more familiar form of address. Martin Buber years ago wrote a book called I and Thou. Anybody read that in college? I and Thou? I've got 3 copies. But And in a sense, it's a way of speaking in a familiar way between this self and the self outside of you. And I think the King James appropriately adopts an informal way of addressing when they think of thou. And we're often not sensitive to that kind of language. And thee would be a little more formal, and maybe a plural. Thou would be singular. But there's an intimacy to the King James language that is often lost on us.
So the next question then is, does that go back to the Greek or Hebrew? I mean, is that a sort of a new understanding in the King James, or is that...
The question Jim asked is, does that go back to the Greek and Hebrew? Yes, it does.
Wow.
Yeah. The Greek does not distinguish between a formal and an informal address between the person and the other. And to a degree, then, the King James is sensitive to that. And I want you to know the King James is a committee project. There are about 50 people involved in the translation, as are all modern translations. The RSV and the new RSV were committee projects, and people discuss, they vote, and they come to agreement. So I think in early Christianity there is an informality in the way Jesus, let's say, talks to his disciples, and the King James captures that, which may have been lost actually in the Vulgate. It is interesting. I don't know fully. Other questions about that? Yeah, Drew.
Do more recent translations make use of older manuscripts?
The question is, do more recent translations make use of older manuscripts? The King James, and I was going to say this earlier, was based on manuscripts that date to the 8th and the 9th century. They're Byzantine manuscripts, and it's called the majority text. What happened in the 19th century and you're going to hate this, colonial powers raided the Middle East. They discovered a lot of older manuscripts. In the late 19th century, in the late 1800s, we get manuscripts such as Sinaiticus, it has the word Sinai in it, and Vaticanus. You can actually read Sinaiticus online now from the British Museum. And these manuscripts went back to the 4th century. So if you have an 8th century manuscript and a 4th century manuscript, what's the difference? A lot, because how the printing press is invented in 1453 by Johannes Gutenberg with movable type. Before that, and this is important for the King James, how were manuscripts transmitted? Manually copied. And how would you make, I know I've done this before, how do you make multiple copies? You could have, I could sit at a desk and have a manuscript here, and I could write here. Or I could have all of you sitting here writing, and I would recite to you orally, and you would write down what I said. Now the problem with that is, what's going to happen? Mistakes were made. You're going to mishear. You're going to hear a word that, here's the problem with English. Homonyms. A word that, light. Take the word light. How many ways can you spell that? At least 2. L-I-T-E, L-I-G-H-T. And the difference, and you might, or even what happens in manuscripts, Jesus Christ, Christ Jesus, we get, or if you're copying this is my favorite phrase, parablepsis due to homo Italietan. Yeah. Have you ever been writing something and you get the same ending on the word on the next line that you're typing or writing? and it looks the same. Parablepsis means to have your eye jump from one line to another because the endings on words look similar. You might jump a whole line if you're copying a manuscript. You might leave it out. And so until 1453, everything was copied by hand. And that's going to, errors will enter in. Again, the King James manuscripts were Byzantine, 8th century, 9th century, good texts. But in the 19th century, they found texts that were 500 years older, which meant they hadn't been copied and copied and copied. Which meant there were words in the King James text which weren't in earlier texts. Take the phrase Joseph and his coat of many colors. You know what the latest translation is? Joseph and his coat with sleeves. There goes the Broadway show. Yeah, Donny Osmond is out of a job. And so modern translators seem like spoilers, don't they? But the fact is, textual scholars, and I studied with Bruce Metzger at Princeton Seminary. Bruce Metzger, if you look in the RSV, the NRSV, he is the lead editor of all those. He was the preeminent text and version scholar in the United States in the 20th century. Text scholars say the oldest is the best.